it's important to be able to communicate effectively why the business glossary is important to everyone else, right? And to be able to defend and be a champion for that. So hopefully we can help build that a little bit in this discussion. So here's let's think about some situations where people would actually interact with the glossary or have a need for a glossary. So here's one where a person in the organization is saying, hey, the finance team, payroll team, and employee recruiting team cannot agree on what a full-time employee means, right? We've all encountered those types of things. So this is a situation where you've got disagreement on the definition of a term or the use of a term. We're going to talk about this topic in some details about how this is maybe not, the solution to this is maybe not what you think, right? It's not always to find one definition. It might be to clarify context and things like that, not to be a spoiler on that topic. But this is a common type of issue that like, oh, I wish we had a reference for this, a way to go say like, well, when you're saying full-time employee, what do you mean, right? Is it this official full-time employee definition that we've got out here? Are you talking about something different? You know, do you understand what our official full-time employee definition is? That's sort of one reason. So another one is someone who this is what I call the sort of consumer or the where the heck did this data come from use case. So here's a person saying, hey, I'm looking at this report and it shows a score for at-risk students. What does that mean? How do we calculate that? So this is a person who is looking at numbers or looking at data and maybe has a healthy bit of skepticism to them and wants to look this up. I did a whole session a few weeks ago. If any of you attended it, thank you. If not, you can find it in the recording on creating a culture of questions around your data. And really what we mean by that is sort of having a healthy skepticism around data and being able to ask questions about what things mean in a constructive and collaborative and supportive way, a celebrated way. And, you know, in higher education, I think this is a really easy case to make, which is, you know, when you talk about academic research, there's this sort of common understanding of this concept of, you know, citation needed, right? So, hey, I've done this research and I have this conclusion, and here we go. And someone's like, I need some citation and evidence and backup, and what's your methods? And it's the same thing with data, and that should be considered a very normal thing. So if someone's looking at this and saying, all right, well, how do we determine at-risk students? I'm not sure I understand that. I'm not sure that makes sense. Can you know, where's the citation for that? Where's the process, the transparency for how that works? So making sure that your glossary is available for that. So the next is maybe a report writer who's saying, hey, how do I pull the current mailing address for a prospect from our CRM, right? So they're not necessarily asking for the business glossary, the functional definition of what a current mailing address. They may know that already, but they're asking for the technical details of that. All right, I know there's a thing called current mailing address that we agree on. I'm trying to pull that for prospects in our CRM. Where does that live, right? So this is the concept of a technical definition or technical guidance related to a glossary term. So you think of the report writer or an analyst or anyone else trying to pull data out of the systems, or a developer who has that a kind of question and need. All right, so here's someone now who's saying, hey, I need a report listing customer satisfaction rates for all licensed customers by product and by number of years licensed. So this is not a real good higher ed example, but you can understand this. So this is what we call in our little profiles of data governance users, the IDA asker person, right? So this is someone who's requesting a report, and they may or may not know if customer satisfaction rate or all licensed customers or product or number of years licensed is something that is defined in your glossary, but they know these are the things they're asking for. So during the process of going back and saying to that person, okay, you want this report for customer satisfaction rates, and we have it, so you can go to the glossary and say, oh, we have a definition of customer satisfaction rate that means this, right? And say, you know, where are we pulling that? Are we going to pull that from our CRM? Are we going to pull that from our, you know, product database or whatever? Yeah, all right. So we've got, we have a definition for this. Is this what you're looking for? And they say, oh yeah, that's the correct definition of what I'm talking about. All right, and this is what we mean by all licensed customers. And they're like, oh, well, actually, that's not what I mean. what I mean is that they have ever been licensed, not currently licensed, right? So that's the type of thing where they can see that definition and see that it doesn't really match what they want. And maybe you don't have a definition for currently licensed customers and you want to add that definition. What does product mean? That's another thing. So if you don't have something to neglect, in building out a report or in answering this question, if you don't have, you can sort of look up and say, is this, do we agree on the terms, the vocabulary of what you're, and the definitions of the things you want in this report? If not, can we take this opportunity to add those, right? So this is what we call like emergent content, and we do a whole session on the importance of a data request process as a rich source of information for data intelligence, for information about your data. Like that's probably the point in time where most decisions are made about how you use your data and what your data means. So being able to create glossary definitions, look up and search for glossary definitions when people are asking for things, and if there isn't something or there's something that needs to be modified or updated, to go ahead and create those at that time and involve the right steward. So that's another role there. All right. And then the last one here is an interesting one. It says, our data warehouse team just built out a great model for calculating at-risk students. How do we get others to know about it and use the same rules and calculations? So this is another little flip on how people might be approaching a business glossary. So this is someone who, and this is an important thing to understand, is that a lot of people approach the business glossary, approach your data technically instead of functionally. And not to make an overgeneralization, but IR folks tend to bridge the gap between that, but lean towards the functional side, right? They're having conversations with leadership or users or regulatory or whoever, business offices around data, and they're having functional conversations. How many active students, how are we doing on admissions melt, those types of things. You're not talking about systems and tables and columns and views in the database, right? Now, your IT team and your BI team and your data warehousing team or whatever, oftentimes when they're approaching these projects, it's ideal if they're approaching them from a functional standpoint for requirements things, but oftentimes they're building out things and their whole world is technical. So in this example, you've got someone who is appropriately proud of a model or dimension or calculated value that they've created in their warehouse to show at-risk student attribute. And they, however, aren't sure how to make sure that other people, like the people, understand what they've created and how it's being calculated, and other people might want to use it. So this is where, if you have this glossary, they can sort of, add to that glossary from the beginning, or choose to take something that was created technically, even if it's like purchased from a vendor, and promote that into the glossary, as we say. So taking a technical item and saying, I want to put this in the glossary. So create a functional definition for this, and then add my technical definition for where it is, which we'll talk, which might make more sense to me. So hopefully that kind of outlines the way that people approach this and the types of things where a glossary becomes critical, right? So here's a sort of an example of why another reason the glossary is important is that every conversation you have around data is full of hidden assumptions around what people mean. And if you don't have specific terminology and definitions for things, you can end up with very different numbers and results. It's kind of like if any of your lawyers, you're familiar with certain terms on a contract, have real meaning. It's like my capital C client, or you have a glossary in there that defines what these things mean, because you don't want any assumptions about what these terms mean. You have to be very specific, or else it can be a challenge. So here's this question that we would think, or maybe someone from the outside who's looking at this who doesn't have the kind of experience with data that all of you do, might think, oh, that's pretty obvious. So how many undergraduate English faculty members are in your institution? So let's break this down though. So the how many, does how many refer to head count, full-time count, full-time equivalent? What are we talking about here? So if you've got, are you counting full-time employees as one, or are you counting, an adjunct as one, or just, based on their load? So that makes a big impact on the numbers. undergraduate. So what do we mean by having how many undergraduate English faculty members? Is that the faculty who teach undergraduate courses, or only faculty who are part of that school from an HR perspective? Like, how do you determine that someone is an undergraduate faculty instructor, and how do you count them? English. So what do we mean by English? Is that a based on the subject of the courses that they teach, or and does it include other things like writing, composition, literature, or is it just English as a second language? What do you mean by that? Or is it, again, and this is always the thing with faculty counting, are you talking about the subject of the courses, or are you talking about the department of the faculty member, right? Because you can have an English department and an English course that aren't always the same thing, right? So this is where things come in. So faculty member, we already talked a little bit of this in the how many, but what are we talking about? Just all institutional faculty, only tenured adjunct teaching assistants? Who are you including in that count? What if you've got cross-listed courses to or shared courses to other institutions or things like that? How are you counting that? Now we're getting really in the weeds here. So at what point in time should this answer be valid? Are you talking about the beginning or the end of the term, as of a census date, right now, something else? And that can really impact the numbers. Now we're getting crazy. Does this include faculty, students in a virtual web-based distance learning? If a faculty teaches at more than one campus, they get counted once or more. So what does it mean to be in your institution? Your institution, again, does this include just your institution location, or all locations, or what about someone who's semester at C or something? How does that count? And then lastly, institution. Are you including all schools? Are you talking about the overall organization, or you have a law school or a nursing school or a business school, or does it include continuing ed? Maybe people don't talk about this anymore, but maybe a MOOC, right? Are you counting those? So as we know, these are sort of the things that, if you go back to that example that we said where someone was saying, what, I need a report that does X, Y, and Z. So this question that someone's asking, if you want to have some rigor around the output, you want to tie as many of these things as you can to very specific glossary definitions, so that you say, oh, we're talking about, what is our unique head count of, full-time faculty members in the English department. Get much more specific questions. So, as you probably have seen, if you were to answer that question and came up with your own assumptions, and you had, and so did, and you're maybe doing that report out of the registrar's office, and then you had another person who was doing that report out of the human resources office, you could see how those questions may come to different things. And then you're in a meeting and you said, oh, well, we've got 17 undergraduate English faculty members, and the HR says we have 13.5 undergraduate English faculty members. The consequence of that is that even though you're probably both right, you just made different assumptions, and it's not clear. But the result is that whoever you're communicating that to, be it leadership or whoever asked the question, it's going to undermine their faith in the data in general, and they may end up, whatever they were trying to determine, they may not be able to act on that. The other thing, so this sort of why here is important, is that business glossary content it's an art. It's super important, as we just described, to get clarity and understanding and a reference, a citation source for the conversations you're having around data within your organization. But one thing you should know is that it's difficult to do, and you should embrace the complexity of it to begin with, to set appropriate expectations and pragmatic processes to create it. So oftentimes it requires like orchestration and collaboration and ongoing human effort to get good definitions created. And one of the reasons I like to point this out is that people, with the cookbook, sometimes people say, hey, we want to just start with the glossary. Let's just start with sort of the simple stuff, and then we'll move to the data catalog and other kind of like the technical things. And our experience over these last several years is that it's actually the opposite. Like there's a little bit of an upfront barrier to get kind of technical connectivity into like importing data models and inventorying data systems and things like that. But that has very little need for human curation, political dissent, ownership collisions and things like that. Like it's pretty, like it's just like it is what it is for most of that stuff if you can identify what it is and pull it in. But the glossary content is where you really need good strategies for consensus, and oftentimes you're sitting there with a blank slate saying, I need to define what this is and I don't know. So this is the hard part. Now it's important and it's something you should do from the beginning, but oftentimes people who say, hey, we're going to do the glossary, like the simple stuff glossary, and then move on. What they find out is that the glossary is not simple, and then they lose momentum because they think, oh my God, if that was so hard, I can't think about the next thing. So actually, I think glossary is one of the hardest things to do, to write good glossary definitions. However, again, I'm going to give you some hints to try to make it easier today. All right. The other thing to think about as you're talking about the why is like the value that it brings to different people in your organization. We covered this a little bit in those questions. So you've got your data consumer who's looking at report information and maybe asking questions about what does this mean. You've got your requester who's asking for things, and you want to make sure you get clear requirements and define what they mean as part of that request process. You've got your leadership who's sort of sponsoring the overall initiative, who but also is oftentimes a consumer and requester themselves. You got your report writers who either are creating glossary definitions as they write things, or they're requesting, are pulling in collaborators or experts to help them define things, but they're definitely searching up definitions. You've got your functional data stewards who are providing subject matter expertise and oftentimes authoring or reviewing and approving glossary definitions from a functional standpoint. And then your technical data stewards, it might be a developer or DBA or something, who are providing technical guidance or review or expertise or authoring of the technical definitions for these things. So all those people have a role to play. There's also additionally, there's important value to all of them and having good and accurate and updated information. Additionally, there's other people that we'll talk about here. You've got your sort of, putting the IR group here, sort of an oversight role. They're also, I'm sure, play a role as a steward and a requester and all those things. You've got your sort of champion who's having to train folks, and then committees that are working on this as well. But we'll talk about their role. But in terms of value, like they're helping to facilitate, but having all this information is providing value to all of them, either as authors to share their expertise or to drive clarity and consistency, around their understanding and expertise, or their consumers or requesters.